Okay, so in today's session, we are going to discuss OAuth 2.0, right? We will discuss what is OAuth 2.0, what it provides, what is the use of it, and we'll see how it works, right? We'll understand the in detail that how it works, right? So, what is OAuth 2.0? As per the definition, OAuth 2.0 is authorization delegation protocol, right? So remember, this is authorization delegation protocol and it has nothing to do with the authentication, right? But you may have seen in few in some website or in some places where it is used in the authentication, right? Or like to login users or something like that. But that is not actually OAuth 2.0. That's something different. I mean, extended form of OAuth 2.0, which we call OAuth OpenID Connect, right? Which is built on top of OAuth 2.0. We'll touch a little bit about OpenID Connect as well at towards the end of this our sessions, but we will primarily focus on OAuth 2.0. Right now, as I mentioned, OAuth 2.0 is deal with authorization delegation, right? So, what is the difference between the authorization and authentication? Right, let's understand first this. So authentication is like it's a way to identify or prove the identity of a person or a software or a API, right? And authorization is scope of that person or authority of that person, right? For example, let's take an example. So when you go to office, right, you use your user ID password to access or to enter in the building, or you use your maybe um, ID card, right, access card to enter in the building, right? So once you use your access card, you enter in the building, which means you have authenticated yourself, right? You enter your user ID password, so you are authenticated, right? So that is, you identified yourself to the to your login system in your company or security system of your company, right? But because you have been identified as a someone like as a J, right, it does not mean that you have access to everything in your company or in that building, right? For example, maybe if you work in software department, application development, you cannot access server rooms in the building, or maybe you cannot access admin department, right, or the HR department or the finance department in your company, right? So that you cannot access, you do not have access to other things, right? That is called the authorizations. You do not have authorization to access everything. You have authorizations on the limited things uh, in your company, right? So that is authorization. And our OAuth 2.0 deal with the authorization, not with the authentication, right? So, and we'll discuss this authorization part, but before that, let's understand what it does, right? So as I said, um, your OAuth 2.0 is a authorization delegation protocol. So if you have some power, right, or authority, you can delegate a part of that authority or power to someone who you want, right? Maybe your friend, your colleague, something like that, right? OAuth 2.0, this OAuth provides a mechanism to facilitate that, right? To facilitate that delegation process, right? Uh, okay, let's understand this with an example, right? With a real real time example, right? Real world example, right? And this will be a small story, right? And if we understand this, right, I will able to make you understand the technical part of this OAuth 2.0 and how it works, okay? And then we will let's understand this with this theory, and then we'll look into the technical details, right? Now, say suppose I mean I have deal with this, so that is why I'm taking this example, right? Now say suppose you are in India or in your country, right? And you have a property, right? You have a apartment somewhere in your city, right? And you want to sell it, but due to some reason you urgently need to travel to some different country or some in some different location, right? And so which means you will not be available to make that deal, right? To sign the paper and to sell that property, right? So what will happen in this case, right? So what will happen in this kind of scenario, we can delegate our authorization, right, to one of our relative or to some of our friend, right? One of our friend or relative, that he will work on this particular task or particular thing on my behalf, right? And that is exactly is delegation of authorization, right? And this happens, right, at least in India, this happens through the general power of attorney, right? So what happens, say suppose, okay, so let's understand this with this example. So in our example, say suppose, say suppose this is me, right? And I have some properties in my city, right? Like this, right? Remember that I have lot of properties, right? And there is a reason that why I'm saying I have lot of properties, because we have lot of authorities, okay, that we can delegate or that we can give, right? Now then I have my friend here, right, who I want to give or delegate my authorization. All right, next, okay. Now, say suppose this is the property called ABC, right, which I want to sell, but I'm not available to make that deal. I need to go somewhere. So in that case, what I will do, I will create a general power of attorney, and I give that to my friend, and he will able to take care of that sell, right? So before this happens, right, what we have to do, okay, so first of all, understand this thing that that I will give this authority, right, to sell this property on my behalf, right? That is delegation of authorization, right? And actually, this is what your OAuth 2.0 do. All right. Now, if I want to do this in this scenario, what I have to do, I have to create a power of attorney, general power of attorney, right? So to create that general power of attorney, we have to go to court, right? Local court to create that power of attorney. Now, say suppose this is our court. All right. So to create that power of attorney, what I have to do, I have to uh, go to court with my friend, right? We'll go to court and we'll request the lawyer or whoever the authorized person is there to create a power of attorney, right? So before you create that power of attorney with all the details, right, he will check my identity, right? I mean, he has to verify, right? If I'm saying that I this is my property, he has to make sure that this is actually me, right? So then maybe I will present my passport, right, to identify myself, right? So which means the person who want to transfer his authorities, he has to identify himself, he has to verify himself, right, before he authorize, right? So I will present my passport, then my friend, right, he also has to prove his identity, right, that he is Mr. X or Mr. Y, right? So maybe he will also show his passport to the lawyer, right? After verifying our identity, what this lawyer will do, he will create a general power of attorney, I mean kind of a paper, right? And in this paper he will write all the details, right, stating uh, that this paper authorize Mr. X to act on behalf of J, right, for duration of 6 months to only deal with this property, right? Remember that this power of attorney will have all these detail. What detail? That this power of attorney is only authorized Mr. X to deal with this ABC property, right? Which means it has a specific scope, right? And beside that, it will have a duration, fixed duration for which this authorization will be valid. Delegation of authorization will be valid, right? So now he will have this power of attorney and he can act on my behalf, right? Now if you see, this is to create this power of attorney or this kind of thing, there is a defined rule, and this rule has been uh, defined by the, say suppose, the local government, right? Now in IT, right, this rule, right, which define how I can transfer my partial authorization to a different application or to different person, right, in IT, that has been defined by the OAuth 2.0, and that is the reason we call OAuth 2.0 is authorization delegation protocol, right? And everything in this diagram actually maps to something in OAuth 2.0. Okay, let's look at that. So in OAuth 2.0, there is something called the resource, right? So resource, and then we have something called the resource owner, right? So resource owner owns the resources, and it is somewhere, right? Now, due to some reason, to achieve a particular functionality or something like that, he want to delegate, right, a part of his authorization to another application, right? That application is called client, and this is resource owner, right? And this is basically your resource server. And then we have this code who facilitate this, who actually authenticated us, and who created this power of attorney, right? This is actually called this is actually called authorization server. Okay. And this power of attorney that you see here, right, this is nothing but access token, right? So because client want to act on behalf of resource owner to achieve a functionality, resource owner contacts the authorization server, and it requests the authorization server to give a access token to the client, so that my client access this resource. That is your OAuth 2.0 authorization of delegation of authorization, or giving a partial authorization to someone so that they work on your behalf. Simple. All right. Now see let's understand this with an example. Okay. Okay. Here it is. So I'm not sure, but if you have ever used or not, but I normally use a site called the draw.io to create flow chart or flow diagrams, right? So let me open that. Right. This is that site, right? So this is really good. So if you want to draw some chart or something like that, you can use this site. So now, once you create your diagram, right, it gives you option to save it in one of these location, right? And and it give you option to save in one of these location, and it give you also option to open files that are saved on these locations, right? So what is the scenario now? So if you see, I have a site, right, which is draw.io, which is, and this site may be owned by some ABC company, right? And this application is hosted on some different server, right? But it want to access, just give me a second, sorry. But it want to access my Gmail account, my Google Drive account, to save diagrams, right? Or to it also need access or authorization, right, to read the data from the Google Drive, to save the data in the Google Drive and to read the data from the Google Drive, right? This is what it want to do, this side, right? Now if you see, these are the two different companies, right? Google is a different company, and Google Drive is hosted on different server, and then you have draw.io, which is a different company, completely different company, right? Now if this application, right, want to access Google Drive, right, it has it needs my permission, right? It cannot access Google Drive just like that, right? Either I give my user ID password to this app, right, and then they can use that user ID password to log into Google Drive and save the files and read the files, right? But I do not want to give my user ID password to this site. I mean, although I use a lot, right? I understand that's a good site, but I have lot of information saved on my Google Drive, right? And I'm not okay to give my Google user ID password to this guy, right? So if that is the case, then I cannot use this functionality, right? But if we use Auth 2.0, we can make this working and without giving our user ID password. Okay, without giving our user ID password. So let's see how it works, and then we'll go back to our drawing again and we'll understand. Okay, so if I want to make this working, what I have to do is I have to, so say suppose I want to save my diagrams that I will draw here on the Google Drive. So I will click on this Google Drive. Okay, so it says authorization required. Okay, authorize this app in the Google Drive. So it is asking me that this app means app dot diagrams dot net need authorization in the Google Drive, right? It needs the author. Remember that says it needs the authorization. Okay, now let's see how it works. I click on, so it is asking me, right? Because this guy right now want to access my Google Drive, right? So I am the owner of my Google account, right? So I'm the owner, and this guy want me to authorize. Okay, this guy want this which guy, dot net want me to authorize uh, Google Drive. Okay, so what I will do, let me click on authorize. Okay, let's see what happens. If you see now, I have a pop-up, right, which is okay. It has open a Google account, Google page, right? Because if you can see that this URL has google.com, so it means this page is actually Google page, right? And this page has nothing to do with the app.diagram.net, right? So it is asking me to sign in, right? Now I can sign in here without any issue, without any fear, because I know I'm going to authenticate myself, right, in the Google site. Okay, so I would say I want to log in to that account, right? Using using my Gmail account, Gmail ID, right? Now it is actually not asking me user ID password because think I'm already logged in. So let me do one thing. Let me close this. Okay, and let me log out. Let me log out from my all Gmail accounts. So I want to show you the entire flow, right, so that we understand it completely. Okay, so I guess I'm not logged into any of account. Right, let me try it again. Okay, so let's see. Click on the Google Drive. It is asking me that this app need authorization, right? Some powers on the Google Drive. I said okay, let me authorize you. Okay, so now here is a page which is accounts.google.com, right? Which means I'm going to log into on the Google server, right? Not on the app.diagram.net. Okay, I select this account. Yeah, there you go. Right. So I enter my username. Now I'm going to enter my password. Okay. Click on next. Okay. Now look at this again. So I enter my user ID password, right? And I was authenticated. Okay. I was authenticated on the Google server. I was authenticated by the Google, and I provided my user ID password to Google, not to this guy. Okay. Now it is asking diagram.net or draw.io. Yeah, actually this is the site name, right? Draw.io. Need permission connect. It need permission to connect to Google Drive, right? I can say allow or I can say deny, right? This is the beauty of Auth 2.0. So the authority lies, I mean, decision to take or grant access or give access, right? It completely lies on the resource owner's hand, right? So Google is not making decision based on my behalf whether this guy should have access to my resources or not. It is asking me. Google is asking me, right? And this particular thing is facilitated by the Auth 2.0. Okay, so if I will say allow, it will be allowed. If I will say deny, my choice, right? I will say for now I will say allow. Then it also says that it also need permission. Draw.io also need permission to see, edit, delete, create only the specific Google Drive files you will use with this app. So whatever app files this app will create in the Google Drive, this guy need access uh, those files to edit, delete, and see, right? So that this guy can access it, delete it, and edit it. So again, I can say deny or allow. So let's say, suppose I say allow. Okay. Now it was a consent, right? The two screen that we saw just now, those were the consent. Now we have confirmation, right? So it is confirming that draw.io has asked for some authorization and you have allowed it. Now confirm it finally, and I can say allow. Okay, done. Right, now if I will create a diagram on this site now, right, it can be saved directly in my Google Drive. Okay, now if you see, now draw.io or this application now has access to my Google Drive. Okay, we can see that as well, that if I create a document and then it will be saved in my Google Drive, but that's uh, I mean, you can try by yourself, right? And it works. So, but that is not the concern. But if you see here, right, let's understand this one more time. Same thing happened, something like this, right? So in this case, this guy is your draw.io, right? He need he want access, right? He want access to some resources on the Google server. So Google on the Google server, this is Google server, right? uh, this Google server has my Google account, right? It has my Google Drive account, right? So this is, suppose this is my Gmail account, this is my Google Doc account, and this is my Google Drive account, right? This guy need access to my Google Drive, right? And he need only limited access. I mean, he just want to create some document and see some document. He don't want to delete them or something like that. Or he want to basically see, delete and edit the document that he himself will create, but he will not able to uh, do anything with any other document that I create outside of this application, right? So this is kind of access or authorization this guy need, right? So now we have something called the authorization server here. Okay, so Mr. Client, we call it client, right? It asks me to delegate that access. Okay, so to delegate that access, I authenticate myself with the Google, right? Say suppose this is Google's uh, authorization server, right? The server that authenticate and provide the authorization, right? I authenticate myself against this server. Okay, and when I completely properly authenticate, approve my identity, it provides the access to Google account. Right now, there is other lot of details that happens. I'm not going into that. I'm just giving you a high level overview, and then slowly we'll dig in the detail. Right. So this is what happens, and this is what we understand from our example as well. Right. So this access token, and really it happens. This power of attorney, it go to client, right? And this client take this power of attorney and it go to your resource server, right? And present this power of attorney, and it show that, see, I have the power of attorney, I have the access token, please allow me or give me access to Google Drive. Okay, so this is what the Auth 2.0 is. Okay, and the most important thing that you must have noticed, that I entered my user ID password, right, on the Google site. I gave my user ID password to Google, not to the draw.io, right? I did not reveal my user ID password to the draw.io, right? That is the most important part of Auth 2.0, right? Before Auth 2.0, if draw.io want to perform the same thing, and I mean, if he want to access Google Drive on my behalf so that it can create the document or save the documents here, right? Then there was only one option, and that option was I hand over my user ID password to draw.io. Okay, and then this guy will save that user ID password, and whenever I want, whenever I create a document, say suppose, or whenever I want to fetch a document from my Google Drive, he will uh, use my stored user ID password and log into the Google Drive and fetch the data or store the data. So he will kind of impersonate me, right? And this is not safe, right? And this was a problem. And in fact, if that were the situation, I never had used the .io, because I will never give my user ID, Google user ID password to draw.io, right? So if you see, this is what Auth 2.0 is, and in this uh, sequence of steps, right, we eventually, I mean, if I take my example, in this example, right, I authorized or give partial authority or delegated partial authority of my resource, right, of my resource, which is on the Google Drive, which is on the Google server, which is a Google Drive, to draw.io, right, without revealing my user ID password to draw.io. This is Auth 2.0, right? Now let's discuss this technically and understand that how actually this thing works, right? And some more detail. Okay. So let's move on, right? So to explain this further, right, I have created I have already created a diagram to explain this. Open, right, with all the component. Okay, so now we will discuss this in more depth, more technically, right? But before that, just to clarify something. So in this example, right, in my example, in my property example, right, uh, I was giving authority to my friend, right? But the practical example, right, that I show you, this draw.io, in this one, basically the client, right, asked for the authorization. In my example, I gave the authorization, so it's like push or pull, right? But it does not matter, right? If you want to understand, it's the same thing, right? Eventually I want to this eventually this client want the authorization, right? Partial authorization to perform a task, right? To to sell a property or to save file in my Google Drive. Same thing, right? Now let's understand this further. Okay, with this example. Okay, now we know at least we have four major component in Auth 2.0, right, or in Auth concept, right? First is resource owner, who owns the resource, right? And then we have something called the protected resource. This is the place where our resources resources are located, right? And then we have client. So client is like who want to get the access, right? Who want to get the access to use the resource, right? So in our previous example, resource, I am the resource owner because I owns my Google Drive account. Client is the draw.io because it want access, right? So it want to access the protected resource on my behalf. So this is the client. And then we have the authorization server, right? So authorization server is the component, or the guy who facilitate the whole thing, right? he authenticate, right? So this is like the code actually, right, in our previous example, right? So he authenticates me, the resource owner, and the client, and then if it finds everything okay, then it generates a access token. Access token means your power of attorney, right? Then Mr. Client use that power of attorney to access the protected resource, right? So these are four major components that you need to understand. There are other terms as well that I will explain as we go, but these are three. I mean the four main main participants, right? The client who want the access, resource owner who owns the resource, protected resource. These are the resources, right, which are the protected somewhere, right, on some server. And then you have the authorization server, which authorize the access of resources, right, which authorize the access of resources, right. uh, Now before we move on and we understand the flow uh, end to end, right, let me clarify a few more things, right, so that you can visualize the whole thing properly. This authorization server and the protected resource, right, in our draw.io example, right, is the Google, right? So I was authenticated and authorized by the Google server. That's why we did not realize. But going forward, when we implement this practically, right, I will show this to you in a very clear way, that authorization server maybe, or Okta server, we will use Okta as author or authorization server, and then we will use something else, completely different server or application as the server who will host the protected resource, right? And the client will be something different and the resource owner will be something different. So we'll understand it more uh, clearly. But in our previous discussion, in my previous discussion example, the authorization server and protected resource both were the Google, right? But we send the actually request to different servers, right? We send first request to our authorization server, and then when everything happened, then we send the request to the protected resource. And how it happened, I will explain here, right? But let me clarify one more thing, which is when I'm saying the protected resource, right? Protected resource means it's not like something tangible, right? It's not like a file or something which you can download or something like that, right? When we are saying in IT, right, in this context, when we are saying the resource, it means it's an API, right? For example, like see, uh, the client want to, or draw.io want to save the save a file in my Google Drive, right? So it will not physically go and save something right on the server. It will use a API, right? Say suppose we have API called the save file slash save, right? So it will call that API, something like that. Say suppose so let me write it. How to write here? It is dot add, right? This is a kind of URL, right? So your client will call this, right? It will call this API, HTTP API or .NET API, some API, right? It will call this API, I mean the JSON API or the SOAP API, doesn't matter, right? So it will call this API to save the file. So basically this guy need access to this endpoint, access to this API, and this is what we are referring as a resource, right? And this server can have other resources as well, right? Say suppose in the same example, if I can say, oh sorry, if I can say something like that, save file that delete, or I can say save file, or say suppose create folder, right? So these are the APIs. Okay, draw.io want access to only this resource. Okay, this guy need access to only this resource. Oops. This resource, not anything else, right? That is we are referring as a resource. Remember that. Okay, do not visualize it as a something file or something like that, right? So it will call this API to add a file, to save a file, right? So that is my resource. Okay, now as we have understand the basics, or on a very high level about the Auth 2.0, let's deep dive and understand how this whole thing works. Okay, so in this example, I have a client which is my draw.io, right? And I'm the owner, right? I am accessing or I'm using draw.io. Okay, now draw.io want me to save the file in my Google Drive. Okay, and I like that idea because Google Drive is really handy. I mean, wherever we go, we can open the diagram, and if I am in a meeting or presentation, right, I can just open it and show it to everyone, right? So I want to use that feature. Okay, so draw.io asked me that do you want to save your diagrams of files, created files on the Google Drive? I said yes, that will be great. So client said, or this draw.io said, okay, we can save your file, but as you know, we are a different company, we are a different application, but your Google is a different company. It is hosted on different server, so we do not have access to that server or that application. Then I said, okay, then it's a problem. What we can do? And I said, I'm not going to give my Google user ID password to you because I know you are great, but I don't trust you. And it's very risky as well. Then client says, that's fine. I'm not going to take user ID password. Let me use OAuth 2.0 and you partially authorize me to some resources on the Google server. Okay, then I'm like, okay, I can authorize you partially, right? I'm not going to give you access to my Gmails, I'm not going to give you access to my photos, right? But I can give you access to only save files in my Google Drive, right? Or to read files, and only those files that is created by you, not by any other application or not by me, right? So I can authorize you, or I can delegate that authorization to you. Then client says, okay, let's do that, right? Let's use OAuth 2.0, and you authorize me, uh, partially authorize me so that I access your Google Drive. I said okay. So as I said okay, then what will happen? Client will send a request, right, to authorization server. Okay, so here is my authorization server, right? It will send a request to the authorization server. All right. Now this authorization server has actually, I mean, will have lot of things, but it from Auth 2.0 point of view, it will have at least two things. It will have two endpoints. Two endpoints means it will have two, at least two web services. One which says slash auth and other says slash token. All right. So this guy will send a request to authorization server, right, to the auth endpoint, right? When it this request will send, right, uh, it will provide some details, okay, about itself, like who he is, like his user ID, that we call the client ID, right? It will say, see, this is I am draw.io, and I have a client, right, who says he is who says who is a owner of a Google Drive on the Google server, right? And he want me he want me to access his Google Drive, right? So I need permission to say suppose create files and the read files on his Google Drive, right? So this kind of information will be passed from the client to the auth server. Okay. So it will send let me if I can write, just a second. Yep, let me write it here. Okay. It will send client ID, response type, right, scope, oops, scope, and redirect URI. Okay. So the client ID is his own client ID, right? So that that identify this guy to the authorization server, right? Before so just to understand, right, before this happens, right, before this uh, authorization is made possible, right, there was some background activity has already taken place, right? So this guy has registered himself with the authorization server, and this company and the Google has a like kind of a setup or deal that I will sometime connect you and take the authorization on behalf of my clients. So right, so authorization server know that if I get a ID like 1234, it means .io or the client, this particular client, right? And then the response type, okay, I have response type, leave it for now, okay. And response type we'll discuss in a while. Then we have something called the redirect URL. I will provide you that in a minute. But there is actually one more thing that we call the scope. Scope. Okay. So these information client sent to the auth endpoint, right? Now, what is the scope? Scope is scope, like what authorities or what powers this client need, right? And that is scope. Like I can uh, go to the server room, that is under my scope. I can approve a laptop request, that's my scope, that's my power, right? So what kind of in the scope field, right, is it's like scope equal to, oops, sorry, here, the, these are like the query parameters, right, in http request. So scope is like read files, write files, permission to delete files. So what are permissions or authorities this in this particular request client is asking? So that is come under the scope. So everything, those things will be under scope, right? And then you have a redirect URI, right? And so very important, and you will understand it, right, in a bit. But it's kind of a URL, right, where this guy sends some data, right? So and that is why it is called as redirect URI, right? So we'll come to this as well, right? So we'll discuss this and this in a bit. Okay. So first request client initiate to your authorization endpoint, and it says that I have somebody who says that he has a resource account on the Google Drive, and he want me to access on his behalf. He want to delegate his authorities. Can you look into it? Then this guy authorization server says, okay, now let me first validate you first. Okay. So it will use the client value of client ID, and maybe it will look into his database, something like that, and it will says, do we have someone called A12345, right? 12345, right? And then if the result is yes, then it will find, okay, ABC 123456 is registered client with us, and he's the .io, he's a good guy, that's fine. So let's see who is claiming that he has a Google account. So what will happen, right? Authorization server, as a response to this request, right, resource owner will get a login page. Okay, resource owner will get a login page, right? If you remember, first page, the pop-up window where I enter my user ID password. Okay, I will enter my user ID password, right? Login, right? I will enter my user ID password and enter the submit button. So I will send a response to the Google server. Remember that I'm sending my user ID password to authorization server, which is owned by the Google. So I'm on the safe hand. Now authorization server will validate my identity, user ID password the way they want, right? And if the user ID password is correct, it means I am actually a resource owner, means I have an account in the Google Drive, right? Next, authorization server will ask me that, okay, now we understand that you have a account with us and you are actually a resource owner. We have identified you and we know you are a J. That's a good thing. But your friend .io want to access, or is he's requesting for authorization to create files in your Google Drive account. Do you allow this? right? So I can say yes and I can say no. So if I say yes, it will go to authorization server again, that it is allowed. And then if required, right, it will authorization server will send me the consent, the confirmation as well, that you are allowing .io to do ABC thing, or you are allowing him ABC authority. Is that okay? And if I say okay to that as well, then authorization server will do something. Now, before we go to that, let's understand one thing, that why I was asked only one um, authorization. Because in scope there was only one authorization. In scope, if you say read, write, delete, create folder, right, then I will get prompt for each and every authorization. Understood? Now, so because I have provided my final consent to this authorization endpoint, and everything looks okay so far. So what this authorization server will do, it will generate a auth code, authorization code. Okay, it will generate a authorization code, right? And now this authorization code need to be sent to your client, right? Now this is little bit tricky, and you need to pay full attention, right? So this will generate a auth code. Now say suppose that auth code is 1 2 3 4 6 7 8. Okay, now this auth code need to provide to client need this auth code. Sorry. Now if you see here, I just now send my consent, right? That sorry, the confirmation that all everything is good. You can provide authorization, you can provide access to the client, right? So Auth server generates this auth code, and then what it will do is it will do a redirect, right? Now in the web world, right, if you are familiar with the J2E or something like that, right, and any web technology, there is two things. One is the redirect, other is the request dispatch, right? So this guy will do a redirect. Okay, redirect as a response of this confirmation, right? Because I press the everything is okay and the request is sent to the auth server. Now the auth server will generate a response. In that response, it will submit a redirect request to my browser. Okay, remember that it will send a redirect request to my browser, right? In the browser, right, in that redirect request, right, it will use this value, right? So you remember I said I will discuss about this redirect URI. So this redirect URI is nothing but a another endpoint, right, of this application draw.io, right? So it will be something like, say suppose uh, http, right, uh, slash draw dot io slash um, submit code, submit code, right? So this, as a response to this confirmation, our server will send a redirect request to my browser with this URL, redirect URL, and it will append this code, right? Say suppose code equal to this value, okay, to my browser as a redirect. Okay, so in the redirect, what happens if you have a redirect header, right? Your browser submits the another request, right? But this time this request will go to client server. Okay, and what will be this request? This request will be the same request that whatever value is provided in the redirect URI, whatever the URL was provided in the redirect URI, right? And then the code will be appended on that URI. So that URL may be like URL to a JSP page, right? It can be a URL to a servlet do get or do post method. It can be a action class to your struts, right? It can be a URL to maybe HTTP endpoint in the mule, right? Or it can be a server adapter URL in the Sterling integrator, right? Which means when that URL will that URL will be hit, right, or request will be sent to that URL, something will execute on the draw.io, right? A code will execute in the draw.io. So what that code will do, it will read that token, right? Like the request dot get parameter code. So it will get this value, and this value is called the code, auth code, authentication code. Okay, so that is half 50% of your auth flow in this particular grant. Okay, now so assume your request is with your action class in struts or in the servlet in do get method in the servlet. So your servlet will read the code, and then it will generate another request, right? And it will generate another request to your token endpoint. Okay, it will generate another request to your token endpoint, and this is very important. Okay, so when it will generate another request, your client will send another request to token endpoint. It has to include some information, right? Now this time what information will be sent? Let me write it here. It will be client ID, okay, client secret, and another redirect URI, right? Code and grant type, grant type, grant type. Okay, when your client will send this second request to the authorization server to its token endpoint, it will send these details: client ID, this will same client ID, but this time remember it is sending the password as well, right? Redirect URI, this will be the same URI, right, that was sent in the previous request. Code, this code, or the code that is generated by the auth endpoint, right? And this will be your grant type. Value for the grant type to this flow, the process that we are discussing is the authorization code. Okay, value for this is authorization underscore code, and here the value for response is the code. Here it will be code, right, and here it will be authorization underscore code. Okay, this request will go to your token endpoint now, which means some code will execute here for this API. Now this API will say, okay, I got a request. Now I need to generate a access token for you. But before I generate the access token, I need to make sure that you are the right person, right? And you have the valid auth code. Okay. So it will, now your authorization server will take the user ID password of client, right? 1 second, sorry, it's getting messy. It will take the user ID password, I mean the client ID and client secret, and it will validate that if this request has come from a genuine client, right? And then it will validate the code, right? The code that is generated. So it will validate if this code is generated by our authorization server or not, right? And if it's generated by our authorization server, who was the uh, resource owner who validated it, who authorized it, right? So it will be me, Jay, right? So a resource owner will be Jay, right? And then it will also validate that what grants were requested, what scopes were requested in that authorization, right? It will see, let's say suppose add the file, only one grant, only one authorization, right? It will fetch all those information, it will validate all this information, right? And if it finds everything, this guy will generate a access token. Okay, it will generate a access token. This is really very important. Okay, after validating all this information, it will generate a access token, and it will, so it request has come, right? So there is a possibility to response, provide, send a http response, right? So this will send a response to your client, right? And where that response will be sent, I mean where that access token will be sent, sorry, it will be sent to your this redirect URI, right? So it will call your this token endpoint, right? Once it validate everything, okay, once it validate everything, what it will do, it will sorry, it will take the value of the redirect URL, and it will send a request to that URL with a access token, right? Like in the first, when this redirect URI value was used and request was sent, right? Redirect was sent. It sent the auth code, authorization code. In the second time, in when the request come to the token URL, right? It will send the request to the redirect URL, but this time with the access token. Okay, now, so which means, I mean, some code will again get executed here on the client, right? So that URL, right, say suppose is pointing to a servlet class, right, or it's pointing to a star section class, right? In that star section class, right, your client will retrieve that access token, right? Because that access token is everything, right? That access token is nothing but your power of attorney, right? That access token will have all the detail. Okay, that this request, the owner is J. It will expire in 6 months, and the scope of this power of attorney is to add files. So all these things are mentioned in the, all these things details is mentioned in that token, right? So now your client has finally the access token that it need. Okay, now your client will send another request, right? And for sure this is the final. Okay, it will send another request to the protected resource, right? It will send another request to protected resource with the access token. Okay, your protected resource will get the request and it will say, okay, I can see that you have a access token. You have, it means you have a power of attorney. Okay, let me first see if this power of attorney is valid or not, right? So it has a way to validate it, right? So say suppose it will, for now, right, because we haven't discussed the JWT yet, right? So just for our understanding, say suppose your protected resource uh, connect to your authorization server again and says, I have received a access token which has ABC scope and which was actually authorized by the J. Can you validate it? Um, Authorization server says, okay, let me validate it. It validates it, and if it says this is valid power of attorney or if it's a valid access token, right, you can go ahead and give the access to the resource. You can grant the access, right? So if it, your protected resource get the positive reply from your authorization server, right, it will, right, your Google Drive or Google server will grant the access, right, to the client. Okay, and once it grants the access, it will let the owner know that you have now access, and we can access this access your Google account on your behalf. We have partial access of your Google Drive. We can save your files on Google Drive on your behalf, right? So this is how your OAuth 2.0 work, and this, the diagram that we saw, right, lot of to and fro, this is called the auth dance, right? um, the things that you need to remember is, this is, you have authorization server which authorize, right, and then it generates the access token. Client gets the access token and it then connect to the protected resource with the access token, and then protected resource validate that access token before, I mean, before it give access to the client, it has to validate, right? I mean, before my friend finally make the cell, right, whoever wherever that will be happening, that authority has to validate that if that power of attorney is genuine or not, right? So he has to first validate if that access token is genuine or not. If it finds that that access token is good, genuine, then it give access, right? um, and then your resource owner come to know that now we can do or continue our work. Okay, now this thing, right, that we just now saw, this is one auth dance, or one way to get the access token, right? So this whole play is, or whole drama is to get the access token, right? Once you have the access token, right, you can access the resource on the resource server. To get the access token, we have to do all this, right? In OAuth, there are 4 or 5 kind of uh, or dance, or we normally call it as, we have 5 kind of flows in the Auth 2.0, right? Like authorization code, implicit user password, and client credential and client secret, right? And then there is one more assertion or something like that, right? So what we saw just now, it was the first one. Okay, it was the first one that we call the authorization code, and it is the, I mean, others are other 3 or 4 are simple. This one is the most complex that we understand first. Okay, so point is, okay, so the point is, okay, now let me just clarify one more thing. So when the first request is sent from the client, then the response value of response type is code, right? It tells the authorization server that this is code flow, this is authorization code flow, right? Which means it has to get the authorization from the resource owner, and then it will do all the drama here, right? But when the second request is sent, right, we do not send the response type parameter, right? We send the grant type parameter, and the value of grant type is authorization code, authorization underscore code. Okay, now um, um, so that was the first thing. Now, one other thing, another thing that you need to remember in this is, if you see, as I said, right, I will, when we when I and my friend will go to the court, right, we both have to provide our identity before we get the power of attorney, right? The same thing happen here as well. Before we get the access code in the first attempt, right, when the first flow was running, right, first part, right, I provided my user ID password, right? That way authorization server knew that there is a user in the Google server whose name is Jayaprakash, and his email ID is something something, right? And in the second attempt, when the client sent the request to the token URL, it has sent his client ID password, client ID and client secret, so that it identify itself, right? It validate, it also get validated, right? So both client and the resource owner both get validated, or authenticated on the authorization server in this, in the code flow, right? And what else? Okay, so I forget to mention one thing, that when first request comes, right, your client ID will be validated, right? response type, I have explained how it works, right? Your scope will be validated, that if this client is allowed to request for these five scopes or not, right? Because when this client was set up here on the authorization server, right, that time only it was decided that this guy can access for the it can request for grant to save files, not to delete file or not to create folders, something like that, right? It gets validated. Beside that, this redirect URI also gets validated, right? So this, when this client's profile was created, this redirect URI was also mentioned, right? So I mean, it cannot specify XYZ redirect URI. It has to specify a specific redirect value of redirect URI, and this, or the same value which has already been configured in the authorization server against this client. Okay. uh, so this is our uh, OAuth 2.0, and in the OAuth 2.0, this is our code flow, right? And then we have, I will cover three more code flows, and that we'll discuss maybe in our next session, right? uh, what else? So I have explained you client, resource owner, this. Do I have anything else? I don't think. Okay, then we have something called the JWT, right? That we can discuss. Okay, maybe we'll discuss it tomorrow, right? And JWT is something related to the access token that we this token endpoint generates, right? Okay, I think that's good enough. Okay, so let's discuss one more thing. um okay, let's go through this again, right? uh right now, we know the theory, right? We have the theory, we understand the theory. Let's let's revisit this thing again, right? But the problem is, if I will do this again, uh, it will not follow the same steps because I'm already authorized, right? So I have to do one thing. I have to, if I do this, right, confirm your choice. No, so it's not asking for the it's authorization for the scopes. Okay, so it is directly asking for the confirmation, and then it will give the authorization, right? So let's not sign out. Okay, right? And I also have to do one more thing. I have to log into my Gmail ID and remove this client. Okay, so right, this is my Google account. I will go here. I think there is somewhere connected app or something. Yeah, third party apps. Yeah. Do you see that? This is added. So actually, draw.io requested this access as well to add draw.io as a as a app in my account, right? So I will say manage. I want to remove this. Remove access. Okay. Now it should go to complete flow again. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Create new diagram. If I say change storage. Okay. Let's me open this in the incognito window. Draw.io. Enter. Okay. So this is a step number 1, authorization required. Okay, so it is asking if you want to store your files in the Google Drive, you have to give me, or you have to give, I have to give authorization, partial authorization to draw.io. I say okay, let's authorize me. Okay, now here you go. Right now let's look at this. Okay, client ID. Okay, this is a little bit ugly because it's encoded. This URL is encoded. Let me decode this. And that okay. Now say Control C. Okay, so I have my okay. Here it is, right? Okay. So first thing that you should notice here is that here and here, right? So this is what it is. This is where's my other diagram? Okay, this is the first request. So your client has sent a request to the authorization server, right? Now let's see what all information client sent to the authorization server. I said the client ID, response type, scope, and redirect URI. Okay. I don't need this. Do not save. That's fine. Okay, where is this? Okay. So this request is going to the auth, right? And then you have your client ID, right? This is this is the client ID. This is the redirect URI. Okay, now here you can say response type. Here is your scope. Okay. Okay, so here you can see redirect URI, right? This is actually to separate two parameters, as you know, right? Draw.net. So once that authorizations, okay, let's look at here again. Okay, it will send the request to the /auth, right? And then Google will send me the response, right, with with a form to enter my user ID password, right? And then all the everything, once everything happens, right, your authorization server will send the auth code to redirect URI, right? And I said that redirect URI will be a URL to a servlet or to a struts action, right, on the client server. So that is this, right? So your authorization with server will send code something like that, code equal to 1 2 3 4 5, something like this. All right. Okay, let's come back here. Let's look at here again. Now we are here. Okay, right. So this is what we discussed, right? The response code, response type is code, and these are the scopes, right? And these scopes have a specific meaning, right, on the Google server. These are defined in certain way, right? So if you search in the Google, you can find out, but you can do it by yourself, right? So these are included. Now let's complete our flow. Okay, I will access my username. I will enter my username. The enter name. What was that? Okay, let me type it. Word of integrations. Say next, and the password is this. Okay, there you go. Where are we now? We are here, right? So I enter my user ID password, right? That user ID password will go to the Google authorization server. It will validate that if his user ID password exists or not, and if it exists, if it's correct or not. If it's correct, everything is good, then it will ask for the authorization. Now it is saying that your good friend draw.io have requested these authorization from you. Do you allow? I say connect itself, connect draw.io to your Google Drive, right? It's okay. Now it is saying it also want authorization to see, edit, create, and delete files that it create, right? It will not see or delete or read other files, right? But what files this app create, it will able to read them. I can deny, but I would, for now, I will say allow, right? Now here is the confirmation. Confirm your choice, right? As soon as I will say allow, this request will, this request will go to server again, right? And then it will generate this auth code, authorization code, right? This authorization code will be sent to browser, right, as a redirect. Okay, and then it will be, my browser will call to that URL, something like that, as I said, right? Control C, yep, something like this, right? This is called the auth code. Okay, let's get the auth code, right? And after that, actually what happened, we cannot see, and the reason behind that is uh, simple, right? Because that happened in the back channel, right? So, and after that, there was some code that got executed. That code extracted the authentication code, right? And then it sends the another request to token endpoint with these details, right, that you can see here, right? And then your token endpoint will validate all the information, right? And if everything looks good, then it will generate the access token, right? And then access token will be sent to the redirect URI, right, to the to your client, right? And once that redirect URI code is executed again, right, on that redirect URI, right, it will use that access token that is generated here, like A, B, C, something like that, right? It will Your client will use that access token and send another request to your protected resource, and it will say, see, I have power of attorney, I have access token, please give me access. Then your protected resource will validate, right, that access token. It has to validate it, right? I mean, otherwise you will generate some random number, some random token, and give to the protected resource, and it give you access. Then it will not make any sense, right? It will be useless. So it will be validated, and then if that access token is valid, right, uh, from the authorization server, it will be validated, and if that access token is valid, your client will get access to a specific resource on the resource server on my behalf, right? And I hope this is how this thing work, and I hope you understand that how this whole thing will work. And the most important thing is, we never provided our user ID password to the .io, right? That was the main thing, right? So that is everything for this session. In the next session, uh, either we'll look into the JWT token, jot, and we'll see how that works, or and then we will look into the other four grant types, right? 4 or 3 remaining grant types, right? And remember that this is code grant type, authorization code grant type. Why it is called the authorization code grant type? Because your client has to get the authorization code before it get the access token, right? Okay, thank you.